All right. And we're back with another Talking with Doyle with State Representative Doyle Heffley. As always, we're joined by the indomitable Hunter Kipe and the disembodied voice of producer Chuck on the ones and twos. Representative Heffley, what are we talking about today?
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about election integrity and the election results from the 2024 primary, which was held a few weeks ago in November.
14 days ago, 2 weeks ago today.
What we want to talk about is the counting of ballots, and we've received a lot of calls in our office. Obviously, the U.S. Senate race is very close. It's less than 0.5% of a difference between the victor, Dave McCormick, and the incumbent, Bob Casey Jr. So there's been a lot of talk and a lot of chatter about some of the things that were going on. And we've done a couple of podcasts where we talked a little about election integrity and election law. And this is why the Supreme Court and the courts should not be rewriting statute after the legislature has passed it. And we've highlighted that in other reels about how the courts have really messed up a lot of things. But right now, we're seeing some of the ramifications of that. Here we are in 2024, 6 years after Act 77 was passed. And yet we still have people that want to count illegal ballots, and that's been in the news quite a bit lately.
Didn't we discuss in previous episodes, as we're talking about how to correctly fill out your mail-in ballot, that's the issue currently?
Yeah. So when you go to vote in person, right, you have to stand in line. There's rules, right? You have to be there at the time that the elections office is open, right? The elections office closes 8 p.m. If you get in line at 8:02 p.m., you do not get in to vote in person at the elections at the polling place that day. You have to go to your polling place to vote, right? So if you have where you live, you have your polling location, you go there, and that's where you vote in a time that's allotted. When you go in, if it's your first time voting in that precinct, you have to show ID. If it's not, you have to sign the book, right? You sign your name on a book, and it matches your signature verification. That's kind of how the law is set up.
Yeah.
And then you go over, and they give you a ballot. You fill it out. You then scan it in the machine, and then you walk out the door. You can't take the ballot, walk outside, fill it out. You can't walk back in after you've scanned it in and say, oh, I forgot to vote for this person and you want to change it. No, it's once and done. Now take that and apply that to mail-in ballots. So the law that was set up under Act 77 had a lot of safeguards built into it. However, we know the history of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, altering laws here and there. And anyway, at the end of the day, we have the system we have now. And one of the things the courts has been very clear on is the ballots that are mailed in must follow the instructions and the law to be counted, right? So if you voted by mail or you get that mail-in ballot, you get the ballot in the mail, has your name on it. There's a barcode on the envelope that you send back in. Inside of that, you have your ballot, and it tells you to use marker. So you use a marker to fill your ballot out. You then take your ballot and you must put it in the secrecy envelope. And there's a reason for that in statute. That secrecy envelope is because we have a secret ballot. We don't want people to feel obligated that they have to vote a certain way, so then the elections office officials that are opening it up are going to see how counting votes at that. No, the secret ballot is set up in statute for a reason, and the courts have upheld that the ballot must be in the secrecy envelope. That's inside. And then the outside, there's instructions. On the back of the ballot, you must sign and date the ballot. So when you want to cash a check, you have to sign and date the check. If you don't date the check, the bank won't cash it.
You have to do it correctly.
Yeah. If you don't sign the check, the bank won't cash it. It's no different than voting, and there's reasons for that. There's only a certain time frame that you can vote in, right? So the date is important on there, right? So making sure that you sign and date and date it. The signature is the same when you sign when you go in. So if the ballots didn't come in an envelope, if the ballots weren't signed, if the ballots weren't dated, there's no way to verify that it could have been ballots that were harvested or anything else. So they weren't submitted properly, and the law wasn't followed. The courts have continually upheld that the counties cannot count those ballots. Now, what we have this year is you have a very close election. I think it's 18,000 votes right now, maybe a little bit more, and this is time sensitive because that's changing. So we had Democratic commissioners in Bucks County who wanted to count these illegal ballots, right?
And the illegal ballots, you're only talking about mail-in ballots. You're not talking about voting in person. This only occurred for mail-in ballots, correct?
Mail-in ballots, and then provisional ballots, which is a whole other section we can talk about after
But those are
that.
still, are the provisional ballots filled out at the polling ward, or is
Yeah.
that also a mail-in ballot option too?
No, the provisional ballots would be a last resort to vote in person.
Okay.
But there's very strict guidelines to those, and they can be challenged.
Okay.
So when the ballots come back in, if they're not signed and not dated, none of the security, they're not counted. They're considered to be illegal ballots, right? So they're all put off to the side. Now, Bucks County did that, right? Philadelphia County did that because they were instructed by the courts that if the ballots didn't meet the legal guidelines, and they weren't completed properly, they weren't to be counted. That's the law. Everybody knows that. It's been advertised. So what's interesting is Bucks County, Philadelphia County, other counties, they set those ballots aside because they knew that was a law. Now, we're in the midst of a very narrow race, and they're looking for votes. And this is what I think makes it criminal, right? So the guidance from the Secretary of State, the guidance from the court says you're not to count those ballots. Now they want to find votes, and now they're saying we're going to count them anyway. That is election interference. That's challenging democracy, right? Because we all have rules that we follow when we vote, because you have to have a structure to how the election works. If you want to change the law statutorily, but the courts have upheld it. The Democratic Supreme Court, which is a very liberal court, has upheld that this has to be done that way. But I think what really gets me, and I think what really should upset every single Pennsylvanian, is the fact that they didn't want to count these ballots until they needed more votes. And to change the rules in the middle of an election when they've already been preset, that is criminal. And I think there should be some further consideration to how we're going to follow up on this after
And
the election
since
is done.
the Senate race is so tight, that's an automatic recount anyway.
Yes. So if it falls within 0.5%, then it's going to go into an automatic recount unless the person who has less votes says, "Oh, I'm going to concede and we don't want to recount." But it's automatically going to be triggered by law, as rightly so, and we can recount them. But let's not count illegal votes. Let's recount the votes that were cast.
Yeah, and not add more votes that are illegal too.
Yeah.
So when does that happen? Is there a deadline for that?
I'm not exactly certain in statute, but I think that has already been triggered and that process will start. But then there's also the case of provisional ballots, and you had mentioned that a little bit earlier. So how the provisional ballot works, and there were some Supreme Court rulings that I didn't agree with that came out a little bit before the election started, saying that if your ballot was rejected, you can vote by provisional ballot, which is not in statute, and it should not be allowed because they're giving some people the right to vote twice. If you walk out of the polling place and you forget to vote for something, you don't get a chance to go back in.
Yeah.
That's a whole other story. But provisional ballot, so if you go to your polling place and you say, "I'm here to vote," and they say, "Hunter, you're not on our books." You say, "Look, I voted here every year forever. I know I'm on the books. I know I'm registered," and you have the opportunity to fill out a provisional ballot. And then that provisional ballot has to be signed by the judge of elections, by the minority and the majority inspector. And there's a whole process to how that provisional ballot is then submitted. And then what they'll do is after all the other votes are counted, they go through the provisional ballots and they'll open that ballot and they'll look to see, find your name, and they'll look to see and make sure you were registered to vote in that precinct. And if you were, and if there was an error in the books, you'll still get your vote's still going to be counted. Also, some people were claiming that they did not get their mail-in ballots in the mail. And I think that is an issue that we need to further investigate. So we were encouraging people to go out. If you didn't get your mail-in ballot and you wanted to still vote, you could go to your polling place and vote by provisional ballot. And which time then the elections office, all those provisional ballots go back to the elections office, and after they're done counting, they then will pull that provisional ballot out, and they will look at John Smith fill out a provisional ballot. They'll look over here. John Smith was mailed out mail-in ballot, but was not returned, and then they will count that provisional ballot. If John Smith filled out a provisional ballot and they look in the records, and that's why there's a barcode on the outer. This is why the inner secrecy and the outer envelope of the mail-in ballot are important, because there's a barcode on there that'll scan into that person that their ballot was received. So if the ballot wasn't received, then they'll count that provisional ballot. If the ballot was received, then they don't count that provisional ballot. And that's some of the safeguards. The courts have really altered the law, and we need to revisit it. We did back in with the election back in July of 2022, the Election Integrity Grant Program. If you remember right, the first year when they counted mail-in ballots, it took them like 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
So we actually passed legislation to create a grant program for counties that committed to not stopping. So they were going to count until all the votes were counted. And that's why we don't have these 2 or 3 day lags. What we're seeing right now is just some of those provisional ballots and then these illegal ballots, which certain select Democratic counties wanted to count.
So it's confirmed that they cannot count these illegal ballots.
It is confirmed and upheld by the Supreme Court, as it has in many times and in statute, that they cannot count these illegal ballots.